Hi, this is Eric. Today we're going to look over the game Carlsen Anand, played in Tata Steel in the most recent round. Carlsen essentially played a typical plan that he had been playing in the Berlin against Anand previously, a plan where he plays bishop takes c6 and slightly damages black structure. And in this game he played the same plan but in a slightly different move order. Bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6. Here he played knight c3. So essentially he signaled that he was going to take on c6 on the next move and just basically play a position that theoretically is considered to be around equal. So he played bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and an interesting plan is to play the move knight takes e5. This has been a really common type of plan that we've seen in high level recently, in which a player with white would try to play with two central pawns versus 0 for their opponent. Actually, we saw Carlsen do this during one of his World Championship match games, also in the Rapid. And this has been a common plan, and you reach a lot of positions that even positions in which the computer evaluates them as 0.00 turn out to give a kind of practical advantage for the player playing with the center, just kind of by virtue of controlling slightly more squares. So this would have been a highly interesting way to play. For instance, queen d4 check, winning back the undefended piece on e5, king f1, queen takes e5, and d3. And essentially, white is not able to castle, but he does have a slightly better pawn structure, and he does have relatively easy play. So this would have been an interesting plan to play. His rook on h1 is out of play for the time being, but it will find a way to come into the play very soon. So anyway, he opted for a d3, and essentially what Carlsen's plan was to try to play bishop to e3 and just try to trade off black's c5 bishop, because black does have the bishop pair, and the bishop pair is generally worth about half a pawn. So there is value in trying to trade it off. So black played queen to d6. I personally would have played queen e7 with the idea of going bishop d6, because what this does is it takes all the possible sting out of the plan of bishop e3, because now we're not going to trade off the bishops. So black at least gets to keep the bishop pair for a long time. So what happened in the game is he went queen to d6, and Carlsen just simply played h3, just restricting bishop g4. So bishop e6 was played, and now bishop to e3. This was quite a natural plan, and white's just essentially planning to trade off black's c5 bishop. So black will no longer have the bishop pair. So a typical plan is to play take, something like h6, avoiding knight g5. And I can kind of understand why Anand didn't want to play this, because you'll get positions like this where white may want to play knight h4 and knight f5, but objectively black has nothing to fear in this position. He has no weaknesses and he has a very solid position. So he opted for knight to d7, which was also totally healthy, totally fine. And now bishop takes c5, knight takes c5 was played. Of course, queen takes c5 would have been interesting as well. For instance, if d4, queen b4 is an interesting idea, and there are even ideas of taking the b2 pawn in some cases. So I thought that was a highly interesting way to play too. Knight takes c5 was played, and now Carlsen played queen d2. So he has a couple of options. One is to castle queenside right away. The other is to just try to prepare d4. So now knight d7 was played, and d4. And part of the point is that if you don't play d4, let's say queenside castle, queen e3, then black can just play c5. Now d4, the main central break, has been restricted. So he opted for d4 right away. E takes d4. I actually thought an easier way to play this would have just been a queenside castle, white queenside castles, and black just plays queen e7. So if d takes e5, knight takes e5, the black rook on d8 attacks the queen on d2. Everything's totally fine for black, no major problems here, so I thought this would have been even a little bit easier. But anyway, what was played in the game was totally fine. And now c5 was played. I thought, again, even easier than the game continuation, just queenside castle, rook h8, improving the worst place piece. All of black's pieces look pretty good here, so there are no major problems, really. So anyway, c5 was played, and this did actually make good sense, because after knight takes e6, f takes e6, the point here is that even though black has isolated his e6 pawn, what it does is it does also restrict white's pawns. For instance, any idea of advancing on the king side is not going to be easy to do now. So there is a point. Also the d5 square is controlled well by the e6 pawn, so there was no real drawback to this. So queenside castle was played. I actually like the idea of playing queen g5, attacking the g7 pawn. And one point here is if queen e7, we can play the nice positional idea of h4. The point being that if queen takes g5, we can play h takes g5. We've opened up the h file for our rook on h1. Here we have pretty good play. So I think this would have been a highly interesting plan for white to consider. So in the game, he just queenside castled, and black decided to trade queens, which was a good idea. White took with the king, and one of the reasons for this is that the king can be quite well placed on e3 here. The king is well placed in the center here because there are simply no black pieces that would chase it away from the e3 square. So if we just played, for instance, b3 and we already have the pawn on h3, the king would feel quite safe there. So knight e5 was played. Here I think a better move was just to play h5. The point being that after h4, we can just play rook to d8. And if something like this, like king to e3, now part of the point is that, well, let's say if I just play something like king e7. So if they ever play f4 to try to chase the knight away, the knight has the very comfortable g4 square. So black has no real problems here. So this is just a nice, solid, comfortable position. So this would have been very easy to play. So in the game, he played knight e5, put the knight right on the central square right away. And b3 seemed a little bit better, just to go b3 and then king to e3, because now the knight can actually be driven away. So I thought this was a slight improvement over the game, in fact. But he played f4, knight check, and just went back to defend the b2 pawn. Black played king e7. He could also play rook to d8, just simply trade rooks on the d file. And white played b3, knight to d6. And there are a couple different options here. I actually quite like the move f5. And the point being that if I play f5, for instance, if rook a d8, I can just play the move g4. And this gives us pretty good control and pretty good use of our kingside majority. So here I think black will have a little bit of difficulty playing against the kingside pawns. So I thought f5 might have been even a little bit stronger. But e5 was played, also quite a good move. And now I thought, again, a slight improvement over knight e4 was just to go g4 and to go rook hf1. And here the point is to go rook f2, basically double rooks on the f file. And then now we're in a position to play f5 and then f6 check. And if the pawn comes to f6, then it can actually be a pretty strong pawn. So I was looking at lines like this, and here white definitely has at least a small advantage. So that would have been a good way to make use of white's pawns. So anyway, in the game he played knight e4. Black played the very solid b6. Now white played g4, and black played knight h4. So essentially, white has a well-positioned knight on e4, but it's not easy to turn this into anything. Rook hf1 was played, preparing to play f5. And now I think the simplest move for black would have just been to play rook hf8, just simply stopping the advance of the pawn. What he played was fine too. He decided to trade rooks on the d file. And my assumption is that Anand thought that he would just be able to manage this, because essentially he doesn't have much that's wrong with his position. White's trying to go for f6 now, so black takes, getting rid of his isolated pawn. G takes f5. So the c7 pawn is a possible target for white, and white can play f5, f6 to get a pass pawn. But it's not really so simple. Rook f8 was played, f6 check, really white's only plan, and the f5 pawn was attacked anyway. G takes f6, e takes f6 check. So here the black king has a choice. Do I go to d7 or to f7? So he chose to put his king on f7. I thought d7 was a much better square, and actually there were some tactical subtleties here. If king d7, rook f4, knight g6 attacking the rook, rook to g4. Now I like the very subtle move rook h8, and this move is very easy to miss. And the point is that if knight g5, trying to maybe either play knight takes h7 or support the advance of the pawn, if knight e5, we can simply go king to d6. And this defensive setup is not that easy to spot. The rook on h8 defends the h7 pawn, and the king on d6 supports the nice knight on e5. And part of the point here is you might think, oh, is there rook takes e5 here? Well, the problem is if you take on e5 and try to win the rook in the corner, the king traps it with king to g7. So the knight just simply gets trapped here. So unfortunately, that idea doesn't work. So, after, what's played here? Yeah, so after king to f7 that was played in the game, now there's the move rook to g1, which is actually fairly dangerous. Because the point is, we're threatening rook g7 check, attacking both of the pawns on c7 and h7, and the hog on the 7th would be pretty dangerous. So if rook to g8, there's check, take, and the point here is that after going into the endgame, take, take, we check and go knight d5, and now we can take on c7 and take on a6. And essentially, this type of endgame is very close to the borderline between a win and a draw, and I think it just barely crosses the line and is winning for white. But some quite complicated variations here. We have to give a pawn back to save the knight, but in the end, with the active king and the active knight, it looks like white is just barely able to win this, but that's a pretty deep theoretical discussion, and it's outside of the scope of this. So in any case, that was a very dangerous way to play, rook to g1, but it may have just been simply impossible to calculate for Carlsen during the game, so perhaps he just wanted to keep control of the game how he thought was simpler. So he played rook f4, knight g6, and went knight g5 check. So essentially what he did here is he prepared to play knight to e6, h6 was played, defending the h7 pawn, knight e6, attacking c7, so rook f7's played, defending, rook to d1, okay, we're threatening mate in 1 right here on d8, and now rook takes f6 was played, and now there was knight takes c7 check and knight takes a6. So essentially what has happened is white has sacrificed the f6 pawn, but has won 2 pawns in the process, so white's 1 pawn up. Essentially what happens here is we have an endgame that's very hard for white to win. White has a queenside majority, 3 versus 2, and an extra pawn, but it's not easy to actually turn that into a strong pass pawn. We can play a4 and then c3 and b4 and try to create a pass pawn, but the problem is we don't want to just simplify and trade off all our pawns. So it's not that easy. White's last move was h4, defending the h-pawn. So now knight g6 was played. I thought a little easier would have just been to play knight g2 and then rook to f2, although he may have been a little bit afraid of rook h2, even though I didn't think this was dangerous. But in any case, he played knight g6, very solid move. Rook h1, defending the pawn. Rook f7, going after the knight on a6. So now, I thought the simplest was just to go a4 and basically play ideas like this, where we have ideas of playing c3 and b4. But that being said, black is very, very solid here, and it's not quite easy to tell whether we can really turn this into anything. Probably with accurate play, black is able to hold together the defense here and basically prevent white from creating a strong pass pawn. Notice that white's pawn on h5 is relatively weak. So white is definitely better there, but it's not clear if he can turn that into anything serious. So anyway, in the game, white played the move h5, attacking the knight on g6, knight f4. So the knight on f4 is going to watch the pawn on h5 pretty much for the rest of the game. So essentially that pawn is very likely to drop off. But what white wants to do is white try to activate his knight and have his knight nearby so that at least if the pawn drops off, they're going to trade h-pawns. So now king f6 was played, knight b5, king to g5, knight to d6. All right, the rook is attacked, and they play rook to e7, and now king to b2. So essentially, white is sort of waiting to see if black's going to go after the pawn soon, and will have some possible tactical rebuttals in that case. So rook e6 was played, knight to f7 check. So the nice thing about knight f7 check is that the knight's keeping an eye on the h6 pawn. So king f5, rook to d1, and now the point is black plays king g4 and is about to win that pawn on h5. So the point for white is that he played king c3, and after the pawn was taken, he plays rook h1 check and wins that h-pawn. So king g6, knight takes h6. So it was kind of a subtle, indirect defense of that h6 pawn, but now we have 3 versus 2 on one side, and the black rook and the black knight are both pretty well placed, so this should not be any kind of easy win. So knight to g4 was played. This was a nice idea. So now white is always free to play the move rook h2. So knight to d3 check was played, king to c3, knight to b4, and now rook h2 was played. So this was quite a nice move, and I thought a little bit simpler might have just been to play rook e4 and just keep the rooks on the board, but what black played was fine as well. He decided to go into the knight endgame. It's a little risky to go into a knight endgame down one pawn just because knight endgames offer so many winning properties. simply because the knight has a hard time grappling with a strong enemy king. So essentially here, white just brought his knight into the game. So he played knight f3, knight to e1, and brought the knight into d3, knight to c6. So black, of course, does not go into the pawn endgame. A 3 versus 2 pawn endgame like this would have been losing. So he plays knight c6, knight f4 check, king to c4. So white has at least activated his king more. So knight a7, avoiding king to b5, knight d5, king c6, knight e7 check, king d6. So essentially, white's chasing the king around a little bit here. Pretty sure he didn't have any really strong ideas here. He plays king to d3, king to c7. That was fine. It also actually would have been possible to play b5 there too, but king c7 was the safer move. King to e4, knight to c6, knight to e3. So essentially, at this point, black has kind of remaneuvered his pieces and now has the solid knight on c6, his king there on d6, and everything should actually be fine. He just goes back to c7 and defends the b6 pawn. c3 was played, kind of shoring up these squares b4 and d4 from black's knight. So now knight e7 was played, preventing king to d5. So he goes king to e5, knight g6 check, king f5, knight to e7 check. So he does make a little bit of progress, but it actually shouldn't even matter that much. And now white finally goes for it with a5. And now was a really important decision. This was a huge, huge decision here. And the wrong decision was made. And I think that he just may have miscalculated. There may have been a miscalculation here because the move b5 was played, but I think b5 was just simply a blunder. And essentially what that indicates here is that the reason why Carlsen won this game was because of Carlsen's quote-unquote nettlesomeness, in the words of international master Kenneth Regan, who wrote some reports on Carlsen's play. But essentially, he did a very good job of constantly keeping Anand under pressure. And here in this endgame, I mean, he's a pawn up, but there are pretty tremendous drawish properties here. Essentially, if we trade off one or two more pairs of pawns here, there's just not going to be sufficient winning material left for white. So essentially a5 was played here, and this was a big choice. The big choice here is, do we play b5 or do we trade on a5? Well, I think what he may have been afraid of here, and I assume that this is what was missed. I assume he was afraid of playing b takes a5 because he thought king to d5 would win the c5 pawn. And what he missed here is that there's knight f4 check. And essentially, if king takes c5, well, then there's knight to e2, and the pawn on c3 drops off. So in this case, if king takes, there's knight to e2, and here we simply have a draw. The king cannot come back to the d4 square, and the b4 square is covered by the pawn on a5. So this may have just been a miscalculation with low time, but all credit to Carlsen for just keeping up the pressure and keeping his opponent, forcing him to be vigilant and watchful here. But essentially, the main lesson from this game is just to pay attention. And, if you have a little bit of an advantage, don't give your opponents any breaks. Press them all the way to the end. And if you're a pawn up in an endgame, don't give away any easy draws. And this, especially in a knight endgame like this, where it's a little bit uncertain, especially it may have been uncertain a little bit earlier on to both players whether it's a draw or not. So essentially, b takes a5 would have been a way to draw the game. And in this case, essentially, black is only going to be left with one pawn in the key line with king to d5, knight f4 check. So he played the move b5, and this was just simply a blunder after knight to e3. Essentially, what happened here is that I assume he may have thought knight e2 would save him, but it doesn't, because after knight to d5 check, the knight on d5 defends the pawn on c3. So after king to c6, there was this b4. So knight takes c3 was played, and it did not save the game because after c takes b4 was played, he just played knight to e2, and now there's knight to d4 check. So without wanting to play this out, this would be a losing position after takes, and after king to b4, we just push the pawn up, and white queens too quickly, and so white wins. So it's very understandable why Anand resigned. But yeah, essentially one of the main lessons here is if you're playing as the stronger side, keep your opponent under pressure. Don't give them any easy draws. And if you're playing as the defensive side, definitely pay attention to these possibilities to simplify and simplify down to only a few pawns left and really calculate to make sure that you're not missing something, because in this game Anand missed this nice opportunity to draw comfortably. Hopefully this was informative. Thanks again.